Everybody knows what lifters are. Millions of people around the globe have seen them on TV and the internet, and hundreds of thousands of school children have built them for science fairs around the globe. Lifter technology has been publicized in media as diverse as Wired Magazine, Jane's Defense Weekly, and the Art Bell Show, and makes regular appearances on the Discovery Channel. Quite simply, the lifter is a phenomenon, but it took the hard work and dedication of an open source online community to make it all happen. Where did this community originate? Who were the key participants, and what were the decisions that they made that would change the course of fate for this remarkably controversial device? I'm Tim Ventura, and I'm speaking with Charles Michael Couch about the birth of lifters and where this open source scientific revolution began. Well, let's start out at the very beginning. You were a participant in the JLN Labs newsgroup in 2001 when a fellow member named Russ Jones posted a link to the website of a little startup company called Transdimensional Technologies. This website included research notes on the biefeld-brown effect and also had a video clip of a triangular device levitating in the air. Can you describe the reaction to this that transpired in the group and who was primarily involved with it?
I'll be glad to, Tim. First of all, Russ Jones was a very key member of the group. I knew Russ well enough to know that any link that he posted to the group, I wanted to see, and I wanted to see it right away because he was always bringing us fantastic stuff. And at the time he was working for MCI as a light wave engineer. And I don't know what he's doing right now. I haven't talked to him in a long time. But so when he posted the link, I went to it, and of course I saw what you were describing about the video. And I thought, this is amazing. This thing is flying, and there's no propeller, there's no jet, there's no engine that I can see, and what's going on here. And so I immediately went back to the group and said, posted the link again and said, everyone go here now, and I guess they knew me well enough to know that if I was that enthused, it was something that they should go look at. And shortly after that, Jean-Louis was posting his replication, and so he must have gotten onto the, he didn't communicate with the group very often, but when he did, it was always pretty cool. And at this point, about the next communication we got from Jean-Louis was that he had replicated the thing and had complete plans on, he does things so meticulously. At this point, I think he'd even had the kit laid out in the photo, of exactly the parts you need and all that other stuff. And so that kind of kicked it all off, and everyone began, the people in the group that could replicate, that had facilities and the required things like computer monitors or TVs they wanted to tear up, began making their replications.
The thing that interests me about this is it's almost like the description you hear about with an avalanche, right? It starts with a single stone traveling downhill, and it kicks up a little bit more debris, and then before you know it, you have 100 tons of rock, And
right.
The thing that surprises me about this is November 2001, and you've got that single person viewing the website. Russ Jones posts the link, and then you got involved with it, and then it started to pick up speed.
Right. Well, I think once, the group was always, at this point, was pretty focused on a lot of really neat alternative energy developments, and so it was pretty intensely focused at that time on 5 or 6 major technologies that were being rapidly enhanced by the open source, communications. But when the lifter came along, it was like such a sudden left turn there at let's all go find out what this is. And so it kind of, but it was a very small snowball to start with, and it took a while. I think it was like a year or so before there was even 100 replications.
Sure. Well, to back up for just a second, the JLN Labs newsgroup is located online at http:/groups.yahoo.com/group/JLN Labs. Now, the newsgroup was founded by French inventor Jean-Louis Naudin to provide a community forum to exchange information about a variety of exotic energy and aerospace technologies. And it's also related to Naudin's massive online clearinghouse at www.jlnlabs.org. Now, can you describe the effort at all? Give us maybe a little bit broader perspective and some insight into what the newsgroup was like when you first got involved.
Well, as I said earlier, it was like, at that point, it was really focused. I think, if people want to give me any credit for doing anything, I think my main contribution was to help focus the group. At that point, I had no laboratory facilities of my own, and I couldn't really do any actual experiments. And so I was just more or less suggesting the direction selection of, a new application or maybe a new something to test at a different point. And they collected a small core of people that were very focused on seemingly the same things. It's like all of us seem to sense intuitively, or it made just a lot of sense to each of us that these were the technologies to focus on, and this was the path to take. And so it was really kind of a magical little place to be, kind of like a coffee shop with the great minds of any particular field would have been, that we were all sitting in there and we were all kind of like agreeing on what was important and what was working and what might work better and that kind of thing, even about the other technologies before the lifter showed up. Jean-Louis Nauden and there's a guy named Jeff Engel, Geoff Eagle, Egle, I think it is, from Australia, and a couple other people that had pretty extensive websites even back then that had all tended to list the same technologies, and that's kind of strange because there's so many varied technologies out there. It's kind of like it was really unusual that so many people would focus on the very same small areas of these as having great potential and being worthy of focus.
Well, for those who aren't familiar with this approach, Naudan's, I guess, modus operandi has been taking an experimental claim, building a replication, and then posting the results and experimental plans online for others to test themselves. Now, this type of open source research has been seen in the past, but Naudan really codified this into a new methodology that people could build from. I think, myself included, a lot of us have picked up on that to be able to say, this is how to do it to bypass some of the traditional scientific rigor and yet still produce hard and fast results.
Well, I think the main thing that Jean-Louis brings is that he's so meticulous and it seems to me that he's bringing laboratory, what would you say, traditional high standards of experimentation and data accumulation, data representation, and it's as though he takes the same thing that normal scientists are doing in their labs and reporting in the journals to their different societies and associations and just making it public knowledge in his website, and he posts things very succinctly and kind of with a newspaper man's eye to top-down reporting, in that the things that grab your eye and hold your attention till you get down to the details are put first, as in a newspaper article, so that it's just brilliantly done. His site is just fantastic,
Absolutely. Well, let's talk lifters for a bit. Now, I personally believe that this may be the single most controversial technology ever invented, second possibly to maybe cold fusion. Now, the lifter takes off and flies with no moving parts, and the explanation is typically that this is either from ion wind or an asymmetrical capacitance effect called the biefeld-brown effect. Can you describe briefly kind of both of these ideologies for us and explain why maybe both sides are so convinced that the other is wrong?
Well, I think probably what I'd like to contribute most here is a third alternative, and that is, to me, it seems like ion wind and what I would call the electrostatic air mass effect. The electrostatic air mass attraction is kind of the title that I would have given to what I came to call the couch theory. And can you pronounce Evnage's name properly? I never have been able to do that.
Offhand, I don't think so. I'm sorry.
Well, anyway, I can't even remember how to spell it, but it's a Swedish name. It starts with an E and has a J in it somewhere.
Yeah,
anyway,
Evgeniev, actually. Isn't it
it's
Barsuk? Evgeniev? Barsuk, maybe? Or...
Okay, that's it. Okay,
yeah.
I'll go with you. Anyway, my theory, and the one that he applied the math to pretty much, was that it's an electrostatic cloud that's created because the wire that's at the top, which is usually the positive conductor, is positive anode or whatever. I get my anodes and cathodes mixed up. So anyway, that wire, the dimension of that wire being so small and the voltage applied to it creates a huge demand for electrons to flow into that wire. And since the wire itself is probably deficient in that number of electrons, it rips them off of the air molecules. And so then you have this massive air molecule cloud that's negatively or positively charged, lacking in electrons, and then having the ground or the negative or the neutral applied to the foil causes an electrostatic attraction between the foil and that air mass. And my theory was that the air mass has more of a weight, has more mass than the foil, and so that the foil is attracted up into the air mass as the air mass is attracted down to the foil.
So, in a sense, this almost might be like a helium balloon to some degree. It creates a cloud that's very massive that wouldn't be visible, filled with charged ions, and the foil is literally attracted up to those the same way that a gondola on a balloon might be brought up with the balloon itself.
Right, and at the same time, the electrode is pushed higher up, and because of the frequency, it's pulsing, and so as the air mass is neutralized through the ions travel and all that stuff, the discharge of those electrons back and forth, the wire itself is elevated above that and creates another mass.
Well, to go to the biefeld-brown for a second, now one of the ideas there, and I guess the vacuum test debates have really kind of solidified the question of this to some degree. The idea is that it's an asymmetrical capacitance, that the wire has a smaller surface area than the foil does, and that this somehow creates an offset effect. And it's possible that this may also span into the cloud, but that this asymmetrical capacitance creates a reactionless thrust.
Well, I've always felt like we're talking about two entirely different things that are both operating, but one is minuscule compared to the other in terms of force, and at least at those voltages, because Jean-Louis Naughton also did some experiments with EHD, and I don't remember what that stands for, but it deals with the asymmetrical effect, and where he has an electrode coming down into a plate that's on like a rotor, and it was tested so that, and they found that they would actually induce movement into the rotor, kind of like the little ball, the little windmill thing you stick in the sunlight, and then the sun hits it, it turns. It did kind of that kind of a motion, and it verified that there was movement induced into the apparatus from the asymmetrical capacitor effect. And I don't know if anyone has checked that for ion electrostatic attraction or anything, but it made sense that possibly that's occurring.
Sure.
But then people did some experiments with what we would call flat panels of a lifter apparatus with a small wire for your positive thing, and then the foil, a wider foil for the negative or neutral. And they would seal it. They sealed it in a dielectric so that there would be something more substantial separating the poles than air. And they had various responses with that. But when I looked at that experiment, my thought was, well, you're not closing off the electrostatic effects that you're going to get from the vertical, or I don't know how to describe this. Although you were filling up the air gap between the wire and the foil in a lateral plane, they weren't doing anything to eliminate that same air ionization and travel across the top of it or bottom of it. It just couldn't go directly from the wire to the foil.
Oh, I've noticed that as well, actually. I did an experiment like that, where I embedded them in plastic. I put the wire and the foil into plastic and noticed that it did do that. It actually followed the surface of the plastic, which I think is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to isolate these two. It
seemed like you would almost need like a solid square block.
Yeah.
And then that's going to have more mass and make it more difficult to register any kind of effect that might be there.
Well, the biefeld-brown itself dates back to Thomas Townsend Brown's work in the 1960s, but the credit for inventing the lifter is generally given to Jeff Cameron, the founder of Transdimensional Technologies. Now, Cameron's claim was that he noticed this effect while tuning laser ionizers in the 1970s, but the triangular shape of the modern lifter can be found on one of Brown's patent applications from the early 60s. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I think probably Transdimensional Technologies was just someone that contract from NASA to investigate the biefeld-brown effect again. I don't know that they invented anything. I thought that I had run across that triangular lifter back in my investigation of Brown's work.
Well, it is mixed because I have seen some biefeld-brown rotators that they've tested also, and it added to some of the confusion about, to be honest, I'd wondered if maybe they were repackaging Brown's work to some degree.
Well, another thing that I found in investigating the old literature from Brown was that he used 100 kilovolts up to 300 and even a megavolt at time, I was told, and that those were the ones that were so dramatically, flew so dramatically. And I was thinking, well, perhaps the biefeld-brown effect comes more into play at higher voltages, So I think that's an area that needs to be investigated. Although, I've spent a lot of time and text typing to try to establish the electrostatic air mass theory, which I think is still different from the ion wind, because what people were doing, I think, was measuring the flow of air across the foil that was generated by the motion of the air molecules, and they would always come back and say, well, that's not enough flow of air to explain the lift that's happening in the actual movement of the craft itself. And so that's why I think it's really important that we establish three different theories, that people don't get ion wind confused with electrostatic attraction.
I've also found in my own experimentation that lower voltages sometimes help improve the ion wind. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but what I found was if the voltage is too high, it creates a slipstream that doesn't include any of the outside air in your overall airflow. So I think that it helps to populate that cloud to keep your voltage a little bit lower than, a lot of people have tested it at 100,000 volts, but to be honest, it didn't fly much better for me at those voltages than it did at 30,000.
Right. Well, for a long time, this may sound really crazy, but I did a whole lot of consulting and advising and remembering what works and what the real specs need to be to get one to fly, and helping people who would come on doing replications, and I would tell them, oh, well, it's not flying because you did this or that and the other, and all the time I had never built one, and so I kind of felt a little bit hypocritical there, and I never really got to actually build one until just last summer, and because of my study and how I had paid so much attention to the way things developed in the group, and who was getting what success with what variation of the different parameters, I was able to construct one really quickly. And the only thing I wasn't sure about is that when I built my first one, I was pretty sure it wasn't going to fly because the foil seemed too heavy. And I'm sure you experienced the fact that if you have a standard aluminum foil, the mass of the foil is actually too heavy for it to lift usually, and so what you have to do is get the very cheapest, thinnest, most delicate aluminum foil you can find, and then the thing flies.
Yeah, although the caveat that I found has been, and I guess this is kind of the beginner's luck thing, the original, the computer monitor worked because it was available, and that's what I started with also. I think I might have been number 40 on the list, so I definitely wasn't the first person to build them. But what I found was when you move up to larger power supplies, in a way, it lets you get away with more weight overall. And that's both good and bad. I went back and tried to rebuild a lifter, a single cell lifter for the computer monitor a few months ago, and it actually was too heavy to take off. And the reason was I'd gotten used to using too much weight to make them stronger.
Oh yeah, and too much weight in the frame, and even too big a wire. Sometimes if your wire is not of the smallest diameter, the wire itself will have too much mass, and also the size of the wire determines the necessity for pulling electrons off of air molecules. If your wire is of such a diameter that it can supply most of the electrons itself, or if it doesn't fall too far deficient in electrons itself, it won't strip them from the air molecules so that you won't have flight.
Sure. Well,
so that what I used was like a one strand from a coaxial cable for cable TV, and I took it apart and pull one of those little strands out to make it fly because it was the smallest diameter I could find around the house, you know. And then lately I've come across some craft wire, you know, that's not probably even meant to carry voltage at all, but it's so small and fragile, and I'm pretty sure that I haven't actually used that yet, but I'm pretty sure it's going to create even more lift.
Yeah, I switched to 50 gauge stainless steel. It
Oh,
was
that
actually
sounds like it'd be great.
Bobby and E recommended that. And
Yeah.
I guess the downside is he sells it. It's a little bit expensive. It's like $20 for like 10 feet or something. But the
Oh,
upside is it just about doubles your thrust.
oh yeah, that's
Yeah.
cool. Well, I think maybe everybody should get turned on to this craft wire because I've managed to pick up quite a bit of that for free because it's everywhere and it's not valued very highly. I think you can pick it up at like Michael's or Hobby Lobby or all those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think the important part to building them, not to go too far off topic, but one of the things I've noticed is that unfortunately some of this stuff is counterintuitive until you start building them. Some of the side effects definitely are things that you wouldn't expect until you see them. But then, um, for instance, a lot of people have recommended using a screen instead of using the traditional lifter foil. And to give a lot of credit to Naudan for not changing the formula that worked, the screen flattens out the E field, and so every time I put a screen on it, it kills thrust. And it's been kind of depressing actually, because that was one of the big hopes that might improve thrust.
Well, I found out when I did my experiment, I found out something that I thought was very key to probably the future of lifters is that I used my very thin wire that I was using for my positive pole. And by the way, these things work in either polarity direction, and that's part of what led me to the theory that explained all the parameters that were there, including the fact that the frequency, 60 to 7, actually they said 70 hertz was the maximum frequency that produced the maximum lift. And so when I put all of the things together, I tried to figure out, well, what forces would satisfy this whole equation. That's kind of how I came up with the theory of electrostatic attraction. But anyway, well, I forgot what I was going to tell you now. Something about the wire.
Oh, well, actually, I was hoping to jump back for just a sec
Yeah.
and ask you about when this started to really start to take off. Did Transdimensional Technologies have any input or feedback for the open source efforts?
I kept wondering about that, and I think possibly that Naughton had some communication with them. And one of the things that Naughton has done, and one of the whole purposes, I think, of his work is that replication is the scientific method of verifying and establishing the credibility of new discoveries. It's like if you do something, just like in the cold fusion experiments, Pons and Fleischmann, I think it is, that was down in Brigham Young University's basement, which, by the way, is where Philo T. Farnsworth developed the Farnsworth fuser, which is strange. But, it's a similar technology. But,
Sure.
what was it? Oh, anyway, the furor that was the fury that was surrounding that controversy was that people could not replicate their experiments, and that was what more or less discredited cold fusion back in that day, whatever year that. What was that? 89?
Yeah, that was the electrostatic inertial confinement, if I remember. Oh no, I'm sorry, Pons and Fleischmann. Yeah, not
Yeah, and they got in their tail on the crackers, so to speak, because nobody else could do what they were doing. And so replication is key. If 4 or 5 other universities had come up and said, oh, well, we did it too and it works, then that would have established it, and they would have gone on from there. And in fact, shortly after all the discrediting was done, other people began to have successful replications, but it was too late. It was too late to establish the validity of the claims. And so now it's taken years and years and years for the body of evidence to accumulate to satisfy the scientific minds that there is something to it.
Well, in terms of ion wind, the NASA claim has been that ion wind, and I guess this would also apply to the electrostatic cloud that you're talking about. They're claiming that this effect is the only thing going on in lifters, but they're also using the inefficiencies in ion wind technology and just the massive energy consumption as a tool to really limit public interest in exploring this technology.
Oh, that's back to my point. Now that I remember it, the little wire that I was using for the positive electrode, I also used an excess of that for my lead from my monitor, you know, so that the heavy monitor lead would not pull the lifter down. You know, I had that smaller, more flexible wire. And what I noticed was that the lead that was connected to the high voltage itself had more lift than the other corners of the lifter.
The cloud would follow the lead up then, and create a much larger cloud overall.
That's my point. That pole, I assume, is getting a much bigger cloud because it's got more of that small wire around it. And so I'm thinking this is probably pointing to the best next effort in terms of improving the efficiency of the lifter is to replicate, is to increase the area of the air mass that is in a proximity to that wire. Maybe put 3 or 4 more layers, and people did experiments with this early on too, creating more layers of positive electrode or negative electrode up there so that the air mass that's affected is larger. And that to me seems like a really viable method of experimentation to improve the lift.
Well, you know, another avenue for research has been, in fact, I connected with a startup company in Texas that claims to have overcome the space charge limitation. And in early 2006, they're going to be publicizing a new technology to demonstrate that ion wind can, in fact, be more fuel efficient than helicopter. And I'm wondering, do you think we're going to see more and more of these workarounds to some of the traditional quote-unquote challenges of ion wind technology?
Well, Evgen, or whatever, you say that again.
Oh, yeah.
He did a lot of calculations to support the theory that it was an electrostatic cloud, but he also went on to compute methods for calculations that would compare it to things like helicopter and lift and you know what the goals had to be to equal that. And I believe that they had already surpassed that kind of lift in terms of power put in, as far as, you know, horsepower or whatever, you know, newtons per centimeter or whatever. And he did those calculations. And so the problem was not that they couldn't get the lift there, or that kind of a ratio of lift to power put in, but it was that they couldn't get the weight of the power supply itself down low enough to have one actually take off with the power on board and be autonomous, as we're all seeking to do.
Yeah, now that was actually my next question, because you have several ideas on how to onboard that power supply.
Yeah, and as much as open source fan I am, I tend to try to hang on to something for my child's college education. but yeah, these are, I think the technology that I'm going to put it forth here too, because I tend to not be able to keep a secret. But have you ever noticed when you take one of those charcoal lighters and you light your grill, you pull a trigger and then the flame ignites on the end?
Oh, usually those are piezo element inside that produces a spark.
Yeah, you know what that is?
Yeah, if I remember right, it's kind of a crystal deformation that creates a high voltage charge.
Yeah, it's a tiny grain of crystal, probably quartz or something like that.
Okay.
And what happens is there's a little spring-loaded hammer that just smacks that little crystal. And that crystal gives off what I've been told is a 9,000-volt spark, which ignites the fuel at the end of the lighter.
So you might be suggesting maybe you could do this with sound even. Maybe an ultrasonic signal could achieve the same thing with crystals that would be on the craft.
Right, or I'm thinking of just someone has suggested, and I haven't had the opportunity to experiment with it yet, but like a little sandwich of piezoelectric tweeters with little piezoelectric buzzers with grains of these crystals in between them and polarity, or even maybe one crystal. There's been some experimentation around that area, and just if you can figure out the maximum. To me, it sounds like the optimal way, or the fastest way and lightest way to get to producing the voltage necessary would be to take small, tiny, lightweight crystals in the lightest mechanism you could design that would excite those crystals to produce the voltage.
Sure. Well, I'd also like to touch for a minute on one of your colleagues in the open source community. Savoir is an indie inventor from Malta who's done some remarkable work in lifter research, and he's also been a part of JLM Labs apparently from the very beginning. The project that he did that really stunned me was his experiment number one on the Blaze Labs website, which shows a spinning lifter in a sealed enclosure spontaneously stop spinning when power is applied. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about Savoir and whether this particular experiment seems to violate conservation of angular momentum.
Oh, well, you've been a source of information for me because I never knew it was pronounced Savoir. I always called him Savior, but I don't. But and you're enlightening me about that he's from Malta because I didn't know where he was. But yeah, he was there in the beginning, and like I say, my contribution to the websites have usually been just being able to suggest a new path to try, or and it turns out, there's no immodest way. There's no modest way to say this. That people who tended to follow my lead, as far as people who helped me by doing experiments that I couldn't do to verify or see what value was in different thoughts that I had, tended to end up becoming pretty successful with it. And Savior was one of those, or Savior, whatever, was one of those people that listened to me, and I'm not saying that I'm responsible for his success because he's definitely gone beyond the things that I suggested to him. But he was one of those people that did put some validity in what I said and tried some of the things that I suggested, and but then he pushed the envelope far beyond that by coming up with the record lifter. As far as I know, he still has that. From the early days, no one has been able to do a higher ratio of weight to lift. And but that experiment that you're talking about, I was thinking about that earlier, and I think what's going on there is that the ion wind is the ion cloud, I'm saying, is electrostatically attracted to the nearest point, so that as the lifter's spinning, when he turns it on, the ion cloud right above the foil is immediately attracted to that area, and so there's an attraction between those areas, and that tends to stop the rotation.
See, I'd wondered, because it's sealed, the best bet, I guess, for an explanation within conventional physics was that it might be some sort of linear gyroscopic effect. A gyroscope self-stabilizes, but I thought, what if you could do that in a straight line? And it's kind of a stretch, admittedly. It's not a perfect idea, but the sealed nature of that enclosure was just so stunning that it's one of those things that captivated me.
Yeah, I thought it was dramatic, but then, and I'm thinking, well, probably because you still have that air mass, and the lifter is kind of locked together with it, kind of like a tractor beam,
Oh, sure.
From the electrostatic attraction. And so as the power is turned on, the air would tend to latch hold of, the whole air mass would tend to latch hold of the nearest foil, and so there would be an attraction in that direction, and in order for the foil to keep going, it would have to haul the air mass around with it.
Well, to switch subjects for just a sec, now purists, the biefeld-brown purists have been searching for years for, I guess you might call it the holy grail of the biefeld-brown effect, which is that, like barium titanate, the solid dielectric material that'll radically enhance the effect and reduce energy consumption. Do you have any thoughts on this in terms of?
I think this whole field is huge. I think there's so many things that could be tried and should be tried. And a lot of us were talking about trying to hammer out a bismuth foil. I think someone even located it. That was one of my big things. I kept calling for somebody to do some experiments with bismuth foil, and I couldn't locate it, and then I couldn't afford it or whatever. And so, like, one person said, yeah, well, I'll get it. I got it ordered. It's coming, blah, blah, blah. Never heard from him after that. So, I'm pretty sure that if it didn't work, he would have reported back. And I'm thinking that there's so many different potential variables to change and alter that all these things need to be thoroughly investigated, and probably are being somewhere by somebody, whether it's in an open source environment or not. It doesn't seem like it because it's not being reported back to the groups if it is. But many of these, there's so many avenues and so many parameters that need to be scientifically investigated and eliminated or or explored. And there's one in particular that I was thinking about when you were saying that. Would you repeat that question just a little bit, and maybe it'll remind me of?
Oh, barium titanate was the big one that was going around, and that was supposed
Yeah,
to be the
I think
dielectric.
people had done the calculations to say that that was maybe that it had the highest dielectric properties.
Yeah, I think it was a
Yeah.
50 time K value compared to, or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm sure it should be examined. But I think the real thing that I haven't figured out is what the structure should be, and it probably is going to have to be like an oval or something. You're going to have to put it in the center of a.
Well, one of the things that I don't talk about it much because it was a quote unquote, proprietary project way back
Right.
when, but transdimensional, I talked a few times. I picked up a couple of interesting tidbits. The first was they were very well acquainted with Travis Taylor. And I don't know what this means or if it means anything at all, but Travis Taylor was the scientist, the Army research scientist, who did the analysis of the ARTS parts, the supposed UFO crash sample.
All right,
And
right.
and that was a solid dielectric. It looks like it was a solid dielectric biefeld-brown material. The other thing that was again just really interesting, I was never sure what to make of it, was supposedly Taylor had set them on the path to replicating a second generation lifter. And when they shut down, I think they shut down in 2002, 2003. The claim was that they had a device that used I believe linseed oil over a cotton fabric with metal plates. They claimed they were getting a 12% to 20% weight loss with it.
Well, I hadn't heard those things, but it's funny you should mention linseed oil because back when I was first investigating Bearden and the MEG and the motionless electronic generator and the that transistor thing, you know what I'm talking about? There's some transistor that works so fast, and they had devised a communication network that was basically instantaneous because it operated on the negative entropy somehow.
Oh, so these are some of the other technologies you've explored then.
Yeah, but anyway, back when I was talking about that, we started talking about relaxation oscillators as means of extracting 0-point energy. And he said, and they were, Bearden said the problem was that most things didn't have a high enough speed to switch quickly enough before the collapse of the fields, so that you could redirect the flow of energy from a ground source.
Oh, okay.
And so, but what he said was that linseed oil somehow, I don't know, I guess a capacitor. Somehow the linseed oil, it seemed like that was what he was saying, had enough speed in its switching or conducting, or I'll have to go back and find out more about that to comment on it intelligently, evidently.
But that was one that actually did work with the relaxation times.
Yeah, and so I thought that was pretty interesting that you would mention linseed oil in relation to that. But as far as that material, did you see in the Art Bell video where they have the little metallic object that's sitting and they hit it with high voltage, and it when you turn it one direction it jumps, and when you turn it the other it just sits there?
Yeah, and that is kind of an intriguing property,
Yeah, and that material, they analyzed it, and it's kind of like an amorphous mixture of
I think it was
bismuth,
and
aluminum, and magnesium.
Yeah.
As
So
I recall.
it's right
Yeah.
along the lines of what might work as maybe a third or fourth generation Biefeld-Brown system.
Yeah, and it was also wasn't it very light as well, as far as, I guess there wasn't a lot of bismuth because that's pretty heavy stuff. But.
Yeah, well, I'm also wondering, I guess I should take a little bit of a divergence here. One of the things that I seem to be noticing, and I think it's really unfortunate, and is in a lot of the news groups, it seems like each news group has a life cycle. I mean, when you mentioned JLN Labs, I would have loved to have been part of this in the 2000 2001 time period, because it just, the kind of genius ideas you guys were discussing was amazing. It was that magical time that you've described.
Well, that list has tended to kind of been a little nomadic. It's like people would, somehow we would all end up gravitating into another list, and right now most of those people are either on Evie Gray's list that Conehead, Cone's in, Johnson from, I think he's from Huntsville.
Oh, okay, okay.
That's funny. He and Bearden and Transdimensional Technologies are all in Huntsville, isn't that strange? Anyway, and they went from Jean-Louis Nons to free energy. I think, the Tim Allen, not Tim Allen, what's his name? You know who I'm talking about?
To some degree, I've seen that trend. The other problem I think is what I've seen is you start out with a core group of people who do wonderful research, and over time you add more and more people who actively participate. But I think what happens is over time the nature of the news group changes, and I'm not sure about JLN Labs, but I know Green Glow has had this issue, and a few of the others have as well. They become so divergent that it ends up being people talking about UFO experiences that have nothing to do with research.
And people tend to keep bringing up the issues that have already been covered, and we tend to rehash a lot for the newbies, and there's a lot of patience in those groups and those people, and they're really gracious people, and so we tend to always try to satisfy the newcomers and point, but it always takes up time and space in the E-group. And the most annoying thing is when everybody starts including a whole digest in their reply, and then whenever you open your digest from that E-group, it's like 200,000 bytes, and you've got to wade through miles and miles of quoted whole digest sticking in each comment, and so that kind of wears everybody down. And then the newbies tend to redirect people, and that's one thing I felt like sort of a moderator role, and there are usually a few people that the core can hang on to what's really valuable in what comes through and tend to focus on that, and it keeps the group focused on productive matters. And then even when something off topic from the current moment is brought in, though that core group seems to really realize whether it's something they need to all start focusing on for a while,
sure,
or include in that central circle of ideas.
Well, and I hope that JLN Labs can remain focused in the way that it has been in the past, because it's it has been unfortunate in some of the other news groups to see it diverge.
Well, I think you're right. It's a pattern, and I've seen it happen in almost every one of them, including it's starting to happen in Evie Gray now, I think. And Evie Gray is kind of a different animal altogether anyway, because Hector is so hard to comprehend. I mean, we have kind of like our own resident guru. I guess he would take the place of Nauden in this group. But Hector was in that group in the early days too. But Hector seemed to come in with such off-the-wall comments, and it took us such a long time to, there was kind of a hint of this guy really knows what he's talking about, but he's like frustrated, and he's belligerent, and he's hard to follow, and that kind of thing. And so it took several of us, I guess Doug and myself and a few others, a long time to just really start listening as hard as we could to what Hector was saying, but there was always a sense that he knew what he was talking about, and he was light years ahead of us.
Yeah.
And so we've got, he's kind of the resident guru in the E.V. Gray group right now, and he's just measuring out a little bit of his knowledge here and there. But his main point is the rotoverter that he came up with a long time ago and has given through the open source public domain.
Well, speaking of which, I'd like to touch on, you mentioned the rotoverter as one. Now, you're working on several exotic space propulsion systems at Couch Systems also, right?
Yeah, well, actually, the main thing I'm working with there, and the Couch System is more or less a little bit of a venture for me to try and retain some sort of proprietary intellectual property ties with some of this stuff, because hopefully I'll get to send one of my kids to college soon. So, but it's kind of like it's open source as much as anyone that agrees to recognize and potentially contribute to my existence can go in there and look at those ideas. And it's basically just a test at this point, and there's only really two things in there.
But as time progresses, hopefully. Now,
right, and I haven't yet put the exotic space propulsion idea in there. There's someone I have Sojourner from the Lifter Group.
Yeah.
He's probably sitting in the seat that Savior had before he kind of went proprietary and took it off list. And he has agreed to test this theory for me, but he hasn't quite gotten to it. He's been a little distracted lately, but basically this idea, and I'm going to be breaking some non-disclosure agreements here for sure.
Oh well,
but,
I mean, you don't have
anyway,
to do that. I
no,
think.
let me do that because this needs to go forward, and I've got so many of these. And I tend to hang on to them a little too long until somebody else brings up the idea in the group, and then I don't get any credit anyway. And the credit I'm not really after. It's just that when you are recognized as having made significant contributions in the past in some field, when you come up with a new idea, people tend to listen to you, and you don't have to go through that whole establishing yourself and your credibility again. And I've been hindered a lot by not having.
Oh, okay.
Well,
yeah,
more.
go ahead.
So let me say this. What this is that I call it asymmetrical. I can't even remember the title I gave it to now, but basically it is inertial, and you take a track and imagine you have this great big ball bearing, and you have a solenoid, and you propel that ball bearing, and you're out in space, and the ball bearing has a track that it follows. It could be like a tube or a track, and as it goes around this track, its angle is altered so that it circles around this track and then comes back to the origin and makes an impact. Are you following me there, Tim?
Yeah.
So what happens is you get the inertial thrust at the beginning from the firing of the solenoid pushes forward against the bearing. Then as the bearing moves away and circles the track, the only energy that's lost to the bearing is the energy to turn it, which is not that much of its actual total energy.
Oh, so it's kind of a Mach's principle idea to some degree.
Yeah, I'm probably not too familiar with that, and I'm one of those
Well, it's definitely a starting point though to build from. So.
Yeah, and then as it curves, you lose the momentum it took to turn the object in a circle and redirect it back toward its origin. And then when it impacts the origin, you add its velocity, which is part of the initial thrust, back to the same direction. And if you paired up systems of these so that you had say a left one and a right one, and you fired them both at the same time, then you would balance that. Even the energy that was lost to curve the ball would be balanced one side against the other so that it wouldn't affect your direct trajectory.
Okay. Well, could I to change subjects for just a sec because we're running low on time.
Okay.
I also wanted to touch on, as you know, American Anti-Gravity is an activist organization, and we try and promote education and then tolerance for breakthrough technologies and the inventors who create them. But I was surprised to learn that you're also doing activist work. Now you're teaching at-risk youth about a variety of alt science concepts and technologies. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that project.
Oh, I'd be glad to. Basically, I found myself, against my will, propelled into a very needy neighborhood of Brooklyn. And since I was here, I got involved with a volunteer organization. And part of my vision is to bring these technologies into actual businesses and manufacturing facilities and that kinds of things, because I think these are the technologies. To me, this is where the internet was right before the bubble.
Sure.
And that these technologies are scheduled to take off any moment. In fact, I believe we are in the launch pad. We've been launched, I think. It's that phase where the rocket is barely moving right after it's fired, and it's just cleared the platform, and it's moving at like a few feet per second. And that's where we are right now with this. And these areas, there's as much as 60% unemployment among the youth, and even among the adults, it's very high. It's like 18% in this particular part of New York. And so my idea is to bring these technologies much as, kind of like if you moved to Silicon Valley before it was Silicon Valley, and you started, a special area, a special knowledge base there, so that people who were in that area had access to it, and it would become known as the area of expertise for that, kind of like the tradesmen and craftsmen of the old Europe, from different areas. And my idea is to help these kids develop futures based on these technologies.
Absolutely. Well, now for people in the local area, I guess that people could get involved with this through your news group, and that's at groups.yahoo.com/group couch systems, and that's COUCH.
Well, actually, right now I'm not really doing a lot of communicating through that. Let me give you my. I have a new email, a Gmail account.
Oh, okay.
Which is I haven't really used it yet, so I think this would be a good way to christen it. Let me give you that address, and then people can communicate with me directly through that, and I can turn them on whatever direction they need to go at that point. And it's just cmichaelcouch@gmail.com.
Okay. So cmichaelcouch@gmail.com. And, well, I guess that concludes our interview. I'd like to thank you again for your time. And on behalf of lifter enthusiasts everywhere, I'd also like to thank you for participating in what really made the lifter what it is today. So again, people can reach you through cmichaelcouch@gmail.com, and definitely keep an eye out in the EV Gray or JLN Labs news groups.
Right.
Thanks again.
I've enjoyed it. Call me again sometime.